Hey guys, so I left off this lecture talking about accelerating the manufacturing process. So, interchangeable parts was a big part of that, being able to fix machines more quickly. Although not fully realized in the 20th century, the use of steam power and production of interchangeable parts allowed workers to complete simple tasks over and over, initiating the concept of the assembly line. So, the assembly line, in the way that we think about it today, will not be quite created until Henry Ford in the early 19 teens. But regardless, this accelerated manufacturing. Now, many products could be produced really quickly. You didn't have to have anybody that was skilled necessarily in labor. All they had to do was know how to do one job. They didn't have to know how to, put together an entire shirt or sew an entire shirt. They just had to know how to sew on the buttons. So you have many people working in the factory specialize in just one task, so you don't have to have skilled labor. And then you have the production of goods increase exponentially. So things now become cheaper. People start buying, their clothes from a store rather than have them made at home. And this will be the same across the board for many of the goods that we use today. Also, we have communication. Samuel Morse. Some of you may recognize his last name. He also developed Morse code. Um, Began or unveiled a working prototype for the telegraph with a simple series of beeps to convey messages. So what this would do, you would tap on the wire, it would send beeps across the wire to be received, and it could be received hundreds of miles away. But those beeps would be converted into letters, and you could send messages over long distances. So communication is increasing as well as transportation at the same time. So now you can send a message in relatively just a few minutes across hundreds of miles by sending those over the telegraph, those electrical pulses over the telegraph. And this would lay the groundwork for the telephone, later on cell phones, all the things that we use today, as well as the internet. We also have mass migration, and we'll talk more about this later on. We'll be talking about the mass of Irish immigrants that came to the United States trying to escape famine. But while adventurers went west, families in the east migrated from rural areas, pretty much farms, to urban areas. So people started moving away from the farms and into the cities to work in the factories because that's where the jobs were. And once they got there, things did not quite look so bright. So now we're kind of seeing the dark side of the Industrial Revolution. And you can see here with this picture, many of the cities, there's no sort of building codes. They're dirty, they're overcrowded, they're smelly, nasty, not a place that you would really want to live. But if you're living during this time period, one of the few places you can find work relatively easy. And so here you can see the population density of the United States in 1850. And you see New England is becoming pretty heavily populated. That's where all the manufacturing hubs were, and this will be important when we start talking about the Civil War and how the North could manufacture goods better than the South could. But you see those population densities in places like New York and Massachusetts, upstate New York. You see it also in Chicago, upper Ohio, Michigan, with Detroit. So we see these major manufacturing hubs spring up in the north, and the population of these places skyrockets. And many of the people coming to these cities are either from the farms in New England or they're coming from Europe. Like I said, we'll see a mass influx of Irish immigrants fleeing famine over in Europe. We also have child labor. So there's no child labor laws this time. If you were able to walk and talk, you might be required to work in the factory to help make ends meet. To survive even the lowest levels of poverty, every family member had to work. This led to high rise in child labor in the factories. Children were not treated well. They were overworked, underpaid, and with virtually no regard for their safety or well-being. It wouldn't be unheard of for children to lose an arm, to even be killed by this machinery. If a loose piece of clothing got caught by the machine, it could drag you in and kill you. And pretty much during this time period, if you got killed, the factory owner had plenty of people that were willing to come in and take your place. So they relatively didn't pay any attention to safety or child labor. All these laws that regulate that will start to come, and we'll see a little bit with the reform movements, which we'll talk about, but you'll see those more in American too in the early 1900s. Many of those safety regulations will be enacted. So we take for granted a lot of that today, things like OSHA requirements that do help keep us safe when working around heavy machinery. You can see here some of the images of children working in the factories. The one on the bottom right, that is a girl. She would probably be a bobbin girl, and she would be in charge of replacing those spindles behind her once they ran out of thread. You can see the young boys up there, probably working in some sort of coal mine with as dirty as their faces look. But no childhood. You didn't get a childhood during this time period. There was no time for leisure, or having fun. Your days were spent working alongside adults in the factories all day. So, again, we see some of the dark sides of the Industrial Revolution. Without any regulation, pretty much you were at the will of the factory owner, and the factory owner generally was most concerned with making money, making as much money as he can. And you can see a piece of propaganda from this time period where you have the factory owner looking like he's about to eat the child, pretty much consuming these children in the factories. And you see more pictures here of how young these children are that are working in the factories, and it wouldn't be uncommon, as I said before, for a child to lose a finger or an arm, to become injured, to become mangled by machinery. And it wasn't like he was going to get paid if you got hurt by these machines. They weren't going to give you any money. You were just going to have to live the rest of your life, you know, being somewhat crippled. And also, the worst part is you could, suffer death. You get dragged into a machine and get killed. Again, these were not uncommon things for these time periods. They're pretty horrific working conditions in these urban areas. Children are often worked 12 to 14 hours with 1 hour breaks. Um, they endured horrible conditions, worked near heavy machinery, dangerous equipment. It was not until the Factory Act of 1833 did things improve slightly for children, but they still were paid a fraction of what adults would get paid. Often, many of them were orphans. They didn't even have any, mom or dad to take care of them. They were just trying to get enough money to eat. And the factory owners would get away with paying nothing. As long as they fed them, a child can't go in and really negotiate, a wage or for anything like that. So some of them were just at the mercy of what the factory owner would give them. And you can see there a young boy working as a chimney sweep, doesn't even have shoes. So again, the conditions in the cities at this time is, they're overcrowded, filthy, kids are being overworked. You can see here, comparing child labor to slavery with this propaganda poster. This will be an argument that many Southerners will say against, the Northerners that, look how you're working people in the factories. That's, not much different than what's going on here in the South. Supplying cotton to the North required massive amounts of slave labor. Again, as I said, this would increase in the South. So with the invention of the cotton gin, even though it made cleaning cotton easier and reduced the manual labor needed for that process, still growing cotton required massive amounts of labor. So after the cotton gin is invented, slavery still spreads throughout the South. And you can see here the conditions on the cotton plantations, not much better than the conditions that you saw in the factories in the North. Also, we have the issue of pollution without regulation. Burning massive amounts of coal with steam engines harm the environment at astronomical levels. Factories dump toxic waste into rivers. You can still see some of the effects of this today in some of the water systems in New England, still holding some of the remnants of this heavy pollution. There was no regulation on what industry could do. They could just dump like toxic waste into the water and nobody would bat an eye. Nobody really knew exactly how toxic it was. Also, we have the spread of disease. With the cities being overcrowded, a lot of people living in these bad conditions, people were succumb to respiratory diseases. If you worked in, like sawmills, or you worked In a textile factory, you're breathing in all that dust all day, and this leads to people developing respiratory issues. Poor sewage systems cause things like typhoid and cholera, which caused from having human waste too close to drinking water. So having like your waste pit too close to your well could cause cholera or typhoid. People didn't figure out what was causing this until later on in the 1800s. And generally, a lack of adequate medicine and dirty and overcrowded living conditions made extremely unhealthy for the masses. And so that's where I'm going to wrap this up. We'll talk more about the Industrial Revolution here and there as we go forward, talking about the Transcontinental Railroad. But this is your first introduction into the Industrial Revolution, and we'll talk more about the repercussions of this as we edge closer towards the Civil War.